Cowboy took an Apache woman home thinking she was injured, then realized it was a marriage ritual. The boot was what I noticed first. One boot, left foot, black-soled, Apache-made, beaded across the ankle in red and yellow. It was sitting in the middle of the trail like somebody had set it there on purpose, toe pointing east. No foot in it, no blood, no sign of a horse throwing anyone, just a boot sitting in the dirt like it had been placed. I'd been riding that stretch of canyon country for 11 years. I knew every wash, every rockfall, every place the cottonwoods bent wrong from a long-gone flood. That boot didn't belong there any more than a clock would have. I climbed down. The ground around it was undisturbed. No drag marks, no scuffle. I turned the boot over in my hands. The beadwork was intact, tight. Nobody'd fallen wearing this. Somebody'd taken it off. I stood there in the afternoon heat with the boot in my hand and a slow, strange feeling settling in my gut, and that's when I heard her. Not a cry, not a call for help, more like breath, a controlled sound, coming from the mesquite thicket maybe 40 feet off the trail. I went slow, drew my rifle, not my sidearm. You don't draw a pistol on something you can't see clearly. The mesquite opened, and there she was, sitting on the ground with her back against a boulder, one bare foot stretched out in front of her. She was holding the ankle. Her face was turned toward me, and it was absolutely still. She was young, mid-20s, I reckoned. Apache, from the cut of her clothes and the pattern of the beadwork that matched the boot I was holding. Her hair was black and loose, and there was a streak of red ochre painted along her left cheekbone that I didn't understand. I held up the boot, said, "This yours?" She looked at the boot, then at me, not afraid, not relieved, measuring. "I fell," she said, in English, good English. I looked at the ankle. It was swollen, sure enough. The kind of swollen that says twisted, not broken. The color was wrong for a break. I crouched down and set the rifle across my knees. "How far is your camp?" She didn't answer right away. Looked out over my shoulder like she was calculating something I wasn't part of. "Far," she said. That was a lie, or close to it. I'd seen Apache smoke signals 2 ridges over that morning. Their camp wasn't more than 4 miles north. But a woman with a twisted ankle 4 miles from camp with the sun dropping and the temperature already sliding, that's a bad situation however you figure it. "I've got a place," I said, 3 miles south. I can get you there, see to that ankle, and ride you back to your people in the morning." She looked at me again, that same measuring look, then she nodded once. I helped her up. She put no weight on the bad foot, which told me it hurt more than she was showing. I offered her the stirrup, and she took it without comment, swung up onto the saddle with the grace of someone who'd been riding her whole life. I led the horse by the reins. That was how it started. Me leading my own horse like a pack mule, her sitting up straight as a judge, watching the canyon walls go by. My place wasn't much. A stone cabin I'd built myself over 3 winters, set back against a north-facing ridge where it stayed cool in summer. A lean-to barn, a garden plot that gave me enough beans and squash to not starve, a well that hadn't run dry in 11 years. I'd had a partner once, a man named Duckett, who'd helped me put up the first 2 walls before deciding the territory wasn't for him and riding north. I'd finished it alone. It suited me. I got her inside, got her on the cot, filled a basin with well water and a clean cloth, and set to looking at the ankle. She sat there watching me work with the same calm she'd shown on the trail. No flinching when I felt along the bone, no sound. "Not broken," I said. "I know," she said. I wrapped it with a strip of muslin I used for such things, horses mostly, but the principle holds. Made a fire, put coffee on, got hardtack and dried venison from the shelf and set it near her without making a ceremony of it. She ate, didn't thank me, just ate with the same directness she did everything. I sat across the room and drank my coffee, and we didn't talk, and it wasn't uncomfortable. I've lived alone long enough to know the difference between a silence that's trouble and a silence that's just two people being in the same place. This was the second kind. After a while, I asked her name. She said Ishke. I told her mine, Callum Reardon. She repeated it, Callum, like she was testing the shape of it. You live here alone, she said, not a question. 11 years. She looked around the room, at the rifle above the door, at the single coffee cup hanging on the nail, at the blanket folded at the end of the cot, just the one. Long time alone, she said. Suits me. She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. I slept on the floor, gave her the cot, woke before dawn and made a fire and got her more water for the ankle. She was already awake when I got up, sitting with her back straight, watching the embers. By mid-morning the ankle was down some in the swelling. She could bear weight on it carefully. I saddled up to take her back. We rode north, her behind me on the horse, and I could feel the weight of her, not heavy, just present, a hand resting light on the back of the saddle. The canyon country opened up around us, the walls going pink in the morning light, a hawk riding a thermal high above the south rim. She directed me with short words, left here, up the wash, through that stand of cedar. I did what she said. The camp was bigger than I'd expected. 30, maybe 40 people. Wickiups set in a horseshoe, dogs moving between them, cook fires and the smell of meat. A few horses on a line. And when we came down the last slope, people turned to look. A man came forward, older, with a face like carved stone and a bearing that said he was someone. He looked at Ishke, said something in Apache. She answered calm. He looked at me. Then he said something else, something shorter with a different weight, and several people nearby reacted. Not alarm, more like recognition, like something had been confirmed. I helped her down. She put her weight on both feet carefully and walked to the man, more Apache. Then she turned back to me. This is my uncle, she said. His name is Loconant. He thanks you for bringing me home. No trouble, I said. Loconant looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something to Ishke, and she translated without looking away from the ground. He says you are a man who acts before he speaks. He says this is good. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Ishke walked me back to my horse. Before I took the reins, she said, I will come to your place in 4 days. I looked at her. What for? To cook, she said, like that was obvious. I opened my mouth, and she'd already turned back toward the camp. I rode home trying to work out what had happened. A woman doesn't just show up to cook for a stranger. Not in any world I understood. I figured maybe it was some custom of repayment. You help someone, they come back and help you. I'd heard of such things. Seemed reasonable. I spent the 4 days mostly not thinking about it and mostly failing. On the 4th day, I came back from checking the north fence line, and there was smoke coming from my chimney. I came in careful, hand on the sidearm. But when I pushed the door open, the smell hit me, meat, and something sweet, and an herb I didn't have a name for, and Ishke was standing at the stove stirring something in the big iron pot I usually only used for laundry. Sit, she said. I sat. She fed me the best meal I'd eaten in 11 years. I don't know what all was in it. She'd brought things in a pack, dried peppers, something that might have been juniper berries, a kind of root. The meat was the venison from my own larder, but it tasted nothing like what I usually made of it. We ate, she cleaned up. She was matter-of-fact about all of it, like she'd been doing it for years. I watched her move around my kitchen and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Uneasy, but not a bad uneasy. More like standing at the edge of something you can't see the bottom of. Before she left, she said, I will come again in 4 days. Ishke. She stopped. I appreciate what you're doing, I said, but you don't owe me anything. I just gave you a night's shelter and a wrap on an ankle. She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw something move behind those steady eyes. I know what I owe, she said. This is not debt. And she left. She came back in 4 days, and 4 days after that. By the third visit, I stopped pretending it was a repayment arrangement. She brought food, she cooked, we ate together, and then she stayed a while, not long, an hour or two, and we talked. Or she talked some, and I listened, which was more than I usually managed. She told me about the canyon country in a way I hadn't heard it told, not as geography but as history, as story, as a living thing. That ridge was where her grandmother had been born. That spring was where the young men went alone for 4 days to learn something about themselves. The hawk that rode the thermals above the south rim, she knew that specific hawk. She'd given it a name. I told her about Duckett, about building the cabin alone, about the 11 years. She listened without saying much. But I noticed she looked around the room differently after that, not like she was assessing, more like she was understanding something. One evening she asked me about the rifle above the door. I took it down. A Winchester Model 1873, the one my father had carried. I told her where it came from. The dent on the stock from a rock fall in the Sangre de Cristos in 1879. The way the sight ran a hair left, and how you had to account for it. She held it, turned it in her hands. Then she handed it back and said, "Your father gave you this gun and you've carried it your whole life, but you've never told anyone that." It wasn't a question, she just knew it. "No," I said, "I haven't." She nodded, like that confirmed something. A month in, I rode north to her camp to bring back a horse of theirs that had wandered onto my south pasture. Loconant was standing outside his wickiup when I came in, and there were 2 younger men with him. They watched me climb down. I explained about the horse. Loconant listened. Then he said something to Ishke, who was coming from the cook fire. She translated. "He asks if you understand what is happening." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She glanced at Loconant. He said something else. "He says that when a woman of our people removes her boot and waits on the trail, it is a way of asking a man to show his nature. If he passes, he passes. If he stops, she sees what he does. If he brings her home and gives shelter and asks nothing, this is already an answer." I stood there with the horse's reins in my hand. An answer to what? Ishke met my eyes. To whether he is a man who can be trusted with something worth trusting. The young men behind Loconant were very studiously looking at other things. "You twisted your ankle on purpose," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The ankle was real. But you put the boot in the trail on purpose." Another pause, longer. "There are men who ride past," she said. "There are men who stop but take what they want. There are men who help and then expect to be repaid in ways a woman should not repay. And then there are men who just bring you home. Wrap the ankle, sleep on the floor." She looked at me straight. "I wanted to know which one you were." I let that settle. The horse shifted beside me, bumped my shoulder with his nose. "And your uncle," I said. "The things he said when we rode in. The things people reacted to." "He said the man who brought me back had good hands. Hands that work, that help, that don't grab." She paused. "In our way, this is the beginning of a thing." "What thing?" She looked at the ground, which was the first time I'd seen her look at the ground when she was talking to me. "A life," she said, "if both people want it." I rode home alone. I sat in the cabin that night without making a fire, just sat in the dark with the Winchester across my knees, and I thought about 11 years. I thought about Duckett riding north. I thought about the single coffee cup on the nail. I thought about the silence of the place in winter, which I had told myself suited me, and which, I now understood, I had simply gotten used to the way you get used to a boot that doesn't fit quite right. I thought about a woman who had measured me against what a man ought to be, and found me worth the test. That was the part I couldn't put down. Not that she was beautiful, she was, but that wasn't it. Not that she could cook, though God knew she could. It was that she had looked at the way I lived, the rifle above the door, the single blanket, the garden I kept up out of stubbornness more than hope, and she had seen something worth choosing. Nobody had done that, not in a long time, maybe not ever in the way she'd done it. I sat there until the stars came through the window and the coyotes started their conversation out on the mesa, and somewhere in the middle of all that sitting, I made up my mind. I rode back to the camp 2 days later, sober and saddled before dawn, because I wanted to be there at a reasonable hour, and I'd underestimated the distance the first time. I rode in as the cook fires were coming up, the smell of mesquite smoke drifting down the canyon. Loconant was there. I asked to speak to him. What I said was this. I told him I understood the tradition wasn't quite what I was used to. I told him I didn't have much. I told him what I did have was solid land that was paid for, a water source that hadn't failed, a pair of hands that knew how to fix most things and weren't afraid of the ones they didn't. I told him I'd treated her right and intended to keep treating her right, and I wasn't a man who needed to be told how to do that. He listened to the whole thing, then he looked at me for a long time. Then he looked past me. I turned around. Ishke was standing 20 feet behind me, arms crossed, head tilted. She'd been there for at least half of what I'd said. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked like a woman who had heard what she needed to hear and was deciding whether to say so. Then she said, "You took a long time." I rode at dawn. I don't mean today. I looked at her. She looked at me. Behind me, Loconant said something in Apache that had a particular tone to it, not quite laughter, but close. "You were waiting," I said. "I was waiting," she said. We married that same month, in the Apache way first, and then the other way when I rode to town, and found a preacher willing to make the trip. I told him it was a long ride, and he said he'd been on long rides before, and he turned out to be a man of his word. The town had opinions, which it generally does about everything. There were looks and there was talk, and there was one fool at the general store who said something loud enough to intend being heard. I turned around and looked at him and said nothing, and he found something else to look at. "Ishke heard about it," she said. "Does it trouble you?" "No." "Good," she said, and that was all she said about it. She moved her things to the cabin in late October, when the first cold was coming off the mesa at night, and the cottonwoods had gone to gold. She brought the pack she'd had the first day she cooked here, and some other things, blankets, wrapped bundles I didn't ask about, a clay pot that was old and cracked, and she set it on the shelf above the stove like it belonged there. It did belong there. I understood that without being told. The first night she cooked again, and we ate, and the cabin had a sound to it that was different. Not loud, just full. The way a room sounds when there are 2 people in it who are supposed to be there. After supper I got up and took the single coffee cup off the nail and got the other one, the one I kept in the back of the shelf for company that never came, and I hung them both on the nail. She saw me do it. Didn't say anything. Just watched. I sat back down. She looked at the 2 cups for a moment, then looked at me, and what was in her face was plain and warm and direct, no performance, no sentimentality, just a woman looking at a man she'd chosen and letting him see that she was sure of it. I reached across the table, and she put her hand in mine. Her hands were strong, calloused along the inside of the thumb from the work she did, and she held mine like she wasn't planning on letting go. "Callum," she said. "Yeah. You were worth finding." I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer for that. You either let a thing like that land or you deflect it, and I was done deflecting. I held her hand and the fire cracked, and outside the wind was picking up off the mesa, and the coyotes were at it again, somewhere out past the north fence, and the cabin was warm. That was a long time ago. I still have the Winchester above the door. The dent from the Sangre de Cristos is still there. The sight still runs a hair left, same as it always has. The cabin has more in it now, her clay pot on the shelf, blankets I didn't own before, a beaded piece of work she made and hung by the window that catches the morning light in a way I never get tired of. The coffee cups are still both on the nail, every morning. She still wakes before I do. I don't know how. I've been an early riser my whole life, and she beats me to the fire every single morning without apparent effort. I've stopped trying to beat her to it. I just come out and the fire is going and the coffee is on, and she's sitting at the table in the gray light with her hair loose, and she looks up when I come through, and that's the whole morning right there. What she said, "You were worth finding," she's never said it again. Doesn't need to. It's in every morning. The fire already going, the coffee already on, the look when I come through the door. I was 62 years old and I thought I understood what my life was going to be. Knew its shape, knew its limits, had made my peace with it. One coffee cup on the nail, a garden I kept out of stubbornness, silence I'd gotten used to. And then one afternoon, a boot in the middle of the trail. I think about that sometimes, how close I was to riding past it. I had places to be, at least I told myself I had places to be. The sun was going down and I was tired, and it was just a boot. Most men would have kept riding. I climbed down. I don't know exactly what it was that made me climb down. Habit, maybe. The way you stop for things that don't belong. Curiosity. Or something older than curiosity. Some part of a man that knows, without being told, that certain things on the ground are worth the time it takes to pick them up. She chose me. That's the thing I still turn over in my mind on the long, quiet evenings when the mesa goes dark and the stars come out, and Ishke is across the table from me with her work in her hands. She had looked at the world of men, had measured them against a standard that was hers and no one else's, and she had put a boot in the trail and waited to see what rode by. And she chose me. Not because I was young, or rich, or the kind of man anyone in town would have pointed to and said, "There's the one." I was a broke-down lone hand with a one-room stone cabin and an old rifle and 11 years of talking to nobody. I was the last man anyone who didn't know better would have picked. But she knew better. She saw the thing I didn't advertise, the way I climbed down, the way I asked before I touched, the floor instead of the cot, 2 cups on a nail. A man can go his whole life and never once be seen by the right pair of eyes. I got lucky. I climbed down off my horse in a canyon I'd ridden 1,000 times, and I picked up a boot, and I walked into the mesquite, and there was a woman sitting against a boulder who was already, in her way, deciding. The fire is low tonight. She's sitting close, her shoulder against mine, looking at the same wall I'm looking at. We've been quiet for a long time. This is the kind of quiet that's comfortable as old leather, the kind you don't want to break. Presently she reaches up without looking and pats my arm twice, just twice. Then her hand goes back to her lap. That's all, that's everything. The fire pops. The wind is soft tonight. Somewhere out north, the coyotes are singing again, and I've learned their patterns well enough by now to know that this is the contented kind, the sound they make when they're full and the night is good and the world is as it should be. I reckon I know how they feel.